another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Daiyan Wolkenstein here with you from the LA Football Network. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts with Daiyan Wolkenstein. The Chargers were on the clock. They stuck and pick with their 5th overall selection, and a selection that was looked at by some as smart, looked at by many as controversial, looked at by another group of saying, did they go the right direction or not? In short, the selection of Joe Alt, the Notre Dame offensive tackle, has been looked at with mixed results. And of course, through all of the fire now starting to kind of dull after day one and try to take measure of everything that ended up taking place yesterday, Dan and I obviously wanted to come on here, give our quick reactions to everything that took place on day one in general and where the Chargers are going to be going from here as it relates to day 2, day 3, what their best options are. And for those of you who are tuning on to ESPN today, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. Daiyan Wolkenstein, you've had a night to sleep on it, as have I. How are you feeling?
You know, I tried to warn Chargers fans. And here we are. You talk about bracing for impact. You talk about like the idea of, building this team for Justin Herbert, specifically to protect him, to enable him to win more games and this team to win more. But everyone gets enamored by like the sexy, the sizzle. Myself included. I was clamoring for Malik Neighbors. But Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz have told us how they felt for months, and most just refused to listen, even though folks thought that wide receiver was important. Chargers fans, anyone watching, listening, it is very clear, given Joe Ortiz's press conference post-selection, given the selection itself, that this Chargers team simply values the offensive line over wide receiver. And Joe Alt was unanimously the best player available on their board for the Chargers. Now, Chargers fans can bitch all they want. And I heard some of that last night from the man next to me. The Chargers now have another generational tackle. If you want to call Rashawn Slater generational or not, doesn't matter. Joe Alt is. Many are saying that he is as good or better than any tackle prospect since Penei Sewell, or even including Penei Sewell. So, Chargers fans, Jim Harbaugh talked about the tip of the spear. That's what the offensive line is to him. It is seen as a weapon, and the Chargers got themselves an offensive line weapon, and now is arguably the strength of the team. So, how am I feeling, Jake? I think I'm feeling like in Jim Harbaugh we trust, and I'm feeling like we should probably start to listen a little bit more.
Yeah, the biggest argument that I'm not even sure if it was argument. I think the perception that Dan and I had, especially as it came to offensive tackle, was we weren't necessarily opposed to the choice of offensive tackle, but what we believed is that to give yourself more flexibility as it relates to moving into the day 2, day 3, that a trade down at that point in time, as it was to be perceived in terms of BPA, would have made the most sense to a trade down, acquire a couple more draft picks, whatever it was, and still end up selecting an offensive tackle. Now, obviously, what has transpired, and I said this a week before the draft, was my big board, Dan's big board, anybody's big board was not going to replicate what was in the Chargers war room. And obviously, that came to fruition last night in terms of what Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz were saying in terms of why they ended up making Joe Alt that selection at 5. On top of that, Dan, when you look at it now in retrospect, now that the first round is in the books, last night was unprecedented in a lot of different ways. 23 offensive players went in round 1. You didn't even have a defensive player come off the board until Latu was the first defensive player selected at 15. And now when you think about this, and Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh said this last night that they are not done addressing the offensive line, but if they were going to pick a tackle, regardless of whether or not we felt it was needed to be from a trade down or if you stuck and pick at 5, 8 offensive tackles went in the first round yesterday. And to find one to the caliber, as Dan said, the unquestioned top tackle in this class. Look at the run of tackles that went therefore the rest of the round one. So, again, we get it. Trey Pipkins was there. Still, in terms of what you're perceiving as it stands now, that you would insert Joe Alt from into Trey Pipkins' spot, which essentially makes Trey Pipkins a expensive backup as it stands right now. But if we are thinking long term, you would probably have to assume that this means that Trey Pipkins' days are numbered. If your future of your offensive bookend tackles are going to be Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt. And this is the long game that Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz are currently playing right now in order to keep Justin Herbert upright.
Yeah, so don't get it twisted. This is a good pick for the Chargers. Anyone out here saying that this was a bad selection on its face is flat out wrong. And again, Joe Ortiz and Jim Harbaugh have said clearly that they value the offensive line over wide receiver. Joe Ortiz was asked about kind of the BPA thing, and Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz alluded to the fact that he was unanimously their best player available for the Chargers when they selected. Now, best player available asterisk for the Chargers, a little different, but I think it's still best player available. But here's the thing. A telling quote from last night's press conference from Joe Ortiz. This is a quote. You talk about the value of each position, the value of the players, and what you see higher. The whys and the hows, but it's a normal process for us. We talk about it, and then we stack them. It's that first part, Jake. You talk about the value of each position and the value of the players who you see higher. I think it's very clear that, in my opinion, it was probably Joe Alt, Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr. were probably the top 3 of their stack in no foreseeable. And I'm assuming the order was Marvin Harrison, Joe Alt, Malik Neighbors. On its face, that is a reasonable best player available big board. That makes sense. So folks saying they didn't go no, they went BPA. You might not like what their BPA was, but they went BPA. The JC Latham smoke, different story. Very different story. And honestly, if I'm putting my PR hat on for a second, Jake, sly move by the Chargers, possibly. Imagine them thinking, oh man, they're going to flame us if we go tackle. So what if we put out there something insane like JC Latham, where folks get really pissed, and then come back, actually get the tackle that's probably the better pick, who's BPA, and 1, smokescreen city, 2, Chargers fans are like, oh, okay, well, at least it's not JC Latham. Like, my goodness. Who knows? That smoke about JC Latham was wild. In a trade back scenario, made sense. But I'll admit it, I was temporarily crushed to see Malik Neighbors not just not selected by the Chargers, but then selected immediately following the Chargers. And that's because we've all talked about this, the importance and the need to revamp the Chargers wide receiver room. So I wanted Malik Neighbors. Everyone knows that. But I also understand this is Jim Harbaugh's team. This is Joe Ortiz's team. And they're going to do what they want. Fans be damned. And they're going to play a style of football that maybe I wouldn't play, but they're going to play it because they think it's the best opportunity to win football games.
It's interesting you say that whole smokescreen, Dan, about J.C. Latham. Daniel Popper actually just dropped this tweet right now. It said, one other thought. Feels like J.C. Latham's smokescreen in the end was to convince other teams to not trade up for Joe Alt. Probably being the Titans in that circumstance, which of course ended up changing everything as it relates to what they ended up selecting. I'll wrap it up with what Dan was saying right there, because yes, admittedly, offensive tackle was not the way that I believed that the Chargers should go should have gone if they stuck in pick at 5. This is no knock to Joe Alt as a player, because as a player, I don't see how you could not look at it to say like, hey, the Chargers got a good player.
Yes.
Which they did. in terms of where that now transitions you for the next 2 days in terms of draft strategy, that is where the fallout comes from this, because Dan and I did mock draft scenarios like this, where if Joe Alt or if it was J.C. Latham that was the perceived pick that the Chargers would do at 5, what was ultimately left over for the Chargers to prioritize? What would possibly be BPA in that circumstance for day 2, day 3? Again, we've been talking trade down for God knows how long as it relates with the Chargers in this pick particularly. And now I feel like for 37, the way that the board has fallen has actually fallen in a great favor to the Chargers, where in terms of certain wide receivers that are still on the board, in terms of players like Jerzon Newton, Cooper DeJean still being on the board. And again, the Chargers may totally go in another BPA scenario here. I don't think that any of us would have expected to see Cooper DeJean still being on the board at 37 today, if he still even lasts that long. There's a couple other wide receivers that number one, Buffalo is going to start today if they don't trade down again by going a wide receiver. You would expect New England with their second pick to go wide receiver here. So who knows what the board is going to ultimately shake out to be. But as I have said, the Chargers have to come out at day 2 with a corner. You have to do this in one form or fashion. But now you also have to prioritize wide receiver, because outside of Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnston, you're essentially throwing this ball to Dax Marius, Tricks, and Hinkle McCrinkleberry, and the Chargers have to find a way to. How are you going to work this draft board? Hell, I wouldn't. We also talked about the possibility that 37 might be the pick that the Chargers end up trading down from in the midst of all this. And really, it should be the strategy after sticking and picking an offensive tackle at 5 today.
Yeah, I think given how this first round unfolded from both, I'll go 2 sides here so we can get into this specifically. Given how the Chargers selected round 1, to say that they need to target a wide receiver, I don't think is really true. Like, they talked about at the press conference that they, don't sleep on Quentin Johnston and Josh Palmer and Semi and Darius and all of them. Like, they might simply believe in them. And so, that's okay. The other side is, given how this team is and the staff, I agree with you. They definitely need to target a corner. And the good news is, as day 1 ended and day 2 now begins, there are players that I think some Chargers fans had no belief that they were going to have a chance at 37, which may have been why wide receiver at 5 was so palpable. But now there's some guys that you're like, holy smokes, they're still there. You mentioned Cooper DeJean. A.D. Mitchell for months, Jake, has been my dream if they could get him at 37. I thought there was no shot that he'd be there. Ladd McConkey's still there. Kool-Aid McKistri's still there. You got a whole bunch of Michigan dudes that are still there. You have the trade back options. You've got Roman Wilson. You've got so many guys. And then you look at the center position. Jake, you and I, we talked about Jackson Powers-Johnson. We talked about Zach Frazier. Nobody was dreaming that they could have them at 37. So many different scenarios that they can go to. So let's kind of get into this real quick, Jake. So if it was you, no, scratch that. Because we've done it for weeks of if it was you or I. And that's clearly not the scenario here. Let's put our Jim Harbaugh, Joe Ortiz hat on of what we know, what we heard yesterday, what we've heard for months. Okay? What do you foresee their day 2 strategy being, realistically?
I've been trying to really process this, honestly, because when you talk about, you mentioned JPJ and Zach Frazier being there at 37, could you imagine that the first 2 picks on the Chargers was offensive tackle and center? I mean, to me, that actually lines up with what they are going for here. And it probably in the bigger picture of things, if that ended up being your first 2 picks, from player-wise, especially if it was either JPJ or Zach Frazier, I would assume that would be a welcome thought. But when you look at it in the big picture of things, to say, okay, once again, who are you having defend in the secondary? Who are you going to be throwing the the ball to in this offense? That's what brings up questions in that regard. Cooper DeJean being here is extremely interesting. I would have to assume that you're going to be addressing the defensive side of the ball at some point today, especially with who could perceivably be on the board still at 37. Jer'Zhan Newton, if the Chargers end up selecting it, because we know that they have to address if we're addressing the trenches like Jim Harbaugh likes to do, you definitely need to do that on the defensive side of the ball, given what that roster currently looks like right now. So that would be a great fall of luck if the Chargers end up making that selection. Again, Cooper DeJean is another one where, in terms of value goes, in terms of a versatile defensive back that nobody expected to be here at 37, that has a possibility of playing out. So if the Chargers are going to go BPA, and assuming what their board looks like is not the same of any one of ours, maybe this is a direction they go. In day two in general, Dan, again, I still think that they have to address the defensive side of the ball, whether that's on the line or in the secondary. Can we start throwing shots at Michigan players as far as who we're going to think comes off the board today? I.e. the Mike Sanders, the Roman Wilsons of the world, the Chris Jenkins of the world, the Junior Colsons of the world. Let's not forget what we have always said about the linebacker position and what Jesse Minter wants in this specific defense. Junior Colson would fill into that very nicely. So not necessarily saying all of these guys possibly at 37, but at least addressed on day two today. This is probably going to be your target areas.
Yeah. So let's kind of get into this for what we hope that they do. Because I find it interesting when we've heard best player available constantly, those three words, best player available, and then there was a little slip addition that was added a couple hours in, I think it was a CBS LA or someone was interviewing Joe Ortiz, and it was best player available for the Chargers or for us. Which I don't know if anybody caught that, but that's basically like merging best player available and fit. That's best fitted player available. So in that lens, Cooper DeJean would be an absolute steal if he can get him at 37. Nobody thought he'd be there. That's corner. Kool-Aid McKinstry, same thing. Those are the two corners, which Kool-Aid probably, as much as Cooper DeJean sounds fun and would be an amazing chess piece for this team needs like a shutdown boundary corner, and like Kool-Aid McKinstry could be that for them. They also need kind of Swiss Army knife, Cooper DeJean too. So you can argue you can get boundary corners later or earlier, whatever. Ladd McConkey, Roman Wilson, Troy Franklin, A.D. Mitchell. There's a bunch of wide receivers that are still there. Now, are they Malik Neighbors? No, obviously. But if you pair the tandem of tackle, wide receiver, let's say both of those were needs. If you went tackle round 1, wide receiver round 2, 3, versus wide receiver round 1, tackle round 2, 3, your tackle combo with tackle round 1 with Joe Alt is going to average out to be better. I promise you. So for you, Jake, what do you see? What do you see as the best players available for the Chargers being for day 2?
I mean, Cooper DeJean is at the top of my list, personally. Jer'Zhan Newton would be right behind him. You keep going down a little bit further, we talk about the wide receiver group. But again, if we're putting our Jim Harbaugh, Joe Ortiz hat on, it would make sense to get a wide receiver here for sure. But if you're putting your hat on, do you really believe that that's where they're going to go at 37? Just think about that for a second. After everything has played out as it did yesterday, and with who's on the board, do you really feel like they're going to go wide receiver here at 37? Which is why I say I think trading out would be the best possible option for the Chargers here.
Yeah, I think trade out could mean wide receiver. But I think if they go stick and pick at 37, while I would want them to go A.D. Mitchell, I think the more fit would be a corner or somewhere in the trenches. And that could be center because that's steal. That would be a great value pick. Jer'Zhan Newton, great value pick, etc. We'll find out how this team is going to be built. And I think it's pretty clear so far that they're valuing the trenches and physicality and just purely overpowering other teams. This is a new era for Chargers fans, for Chargers football. And while it may be a bit uncomfortable because this is the first time we're all kind of ripping the Band-Aid on this, everyone nationally, locally wanted to bring in Jim Harbaugh to fix this franchise. He's doing it the way he thinks is best. Let him cook. Day 2 coming up. Jake, parting words.
I think Trevor Sikkema said it best. When we asked him about his thoughts on Jim Harbaugh, he simply said, whatever he's going to do, it's going to work. And as Dan said, you got to trust the process right now. Some people may love it. Some people may not love it as it currently stands after one day in the books for the draft. But let's watch this play out and let's see the results on the field.
Enjoy day 2. Day 3, we'll have recaps for all of it. For Jake Hefner, for those of you that had a chance to enter the giveaway, thank you. You guys were doing great. We're going to announce that winner today. Enjoy the draft. Day 1 in the books. Day 2, day 3 upcoming. We'll be there for all of it. For Jake Hefner, Dan Wolkenstein, LA Football Network, and Chargers Unleashed. We'll talk to you next on Chargers Unleashed.